if she wanted to call an ambulance or how she wanted to get him there. And she told me that she would let him sleep it off because he'd had a seizure.
February 6th, 2019, Charleston, West Virginia. Michael Cochran collapsed on his kitchen floor, unconscious, barely breathing. His wife, Natalie, called friends to the house. They begged her to take him to the hospital. For 5 hours, she refused. "He just needs to sleep it off," she kept saying. Natalie Cochran was a trained pharmacist. She knew exactly what was happening to her husband's body. She knew what insulin poisoning looked like, because she had just given him the injection herself. But that's not what she told police. Natalie and Michael Cochran looked like they had everything. A beautiful home in Charleston.
A 10-year-old daughter. Successful careers.
Michael, 40, worked in business development, traveled for work, well-liked, devoted father. Natalie, 38, was a pharmacist, smart, capable, trusted in her community. From the outside, they appeared to be living the American dream. But in early 2019, cracks were starting to show. Michael had been stressed for months, more withdrawn than usual, making phone calls late at night, looking into financial records. He'd booked a flight to Virginia for February 7th, 2019, a business trip, he said, but he seemed anxious about it. On February 5th, 2 days before the flight, Natalie canceled it. She told Michael it wasn't a good time. They needed him home. Their daughter needed him. Michael agreed to stay. The next morning, February 6th, Michael woke up complaining he didn't feel well. Natalie made him breakfast, told him to rest, said he was probably just coming down with something. By mid-morning, Michael collapsed on the kitchen floor. That's when Natalie called their friends. When paramedics finally arrived 5 hours after Michael collapsed, they immediately tested his blood sugar. Normal blood glucose range is 70 to 100. Michael's was 21. Dangerously low, life-threateningly low. The kind of low that happens with insulin overdose. At the hospital, doctors asked Natalie, "Is Michael diabetic?" "No." "Does he have any medical conditions?" "No." "Could he have taken anything? Any medications?" Natalie said no. She had no idea what could have caused this. Michael died 5 days later, February 11th, 2019. The death certificate listed the cause as hypoglycemia, low blood sugar, cause unknown. That could have been the end of it. A medical mystery, a tragic death. But then police started investigating Michael and Natalie's finances. And they found something Michael had been trying to uncover himself. Natalie Cochran had been running a Ponzi scheme. For 2 years, from 2017 to 2019, she'd been defrauding investors out of millions of dollars. She told people she had government contracts, Defense Department deals, guaranteed returns. It was all fake. She'd stolen $2.5 million. The scheme worked like this. Natalie would promise investors 10% returns on government contracts that didn't exist. She'd use money from new investors to pay off old investors. Classic Ponzi structure. And she'd spend the rest on herself. 3 homes, trips to Paris, a Shelby Cobra sports car, antique motorcycles. But here's what made it worse. One of the people she defrauded was Michael's own mother. She took money from her husband's family, looked them in the eye, promised them returns, and stole from them. Michael didn't know about any of it. At least, not at first. By early 2019, the scheme was collapsing. Investors were asking questions. Money wasn't coming back. Natalie was running out of ways to keep it going. And Michael had started making phone calls, looking into their finances, asking Natalie about bank accounts. That Virginia trip Michael had booked for February 7th, he wasn't going for business. He was going to meet with financial investigators, people who'd been looking into Natalie's scheme. Michael had figured it out, and Natalie knew he had. But does that mean she killed him? Maybe Michael's collapse really was medical. Maybe the stress of discovering his wife's fraud caused a health crisis. Maybe Natalie refused the hospital for 5 hours because she was in denial, panicking, unable to accept what was happening. People in crisis don't always make rational decisions. And insulin poisoning? That would require planning, premeditation, cold calculation. That's not the same as running a financial scam. After Michael's death, Natalie's life fell apart. She was arrested for the Ponzi scheme in June 2019, 4 months after Michael died. She pleaded guilty, took responsibility, was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. In court, she cried, said she was ashamed, said she'd been trying to provide for her daughter, trying to maintain their lifestyle, trying to keep everything from falling apart. She'd made terrible choices, stolen money, destroyed trust. But that doesn't make her a murderer. Her friends testified that Natalie had been a good mother, a caring person, someone who'd made mistakes but wasn't evil. Her daughter needed her. Losing Michael had been devastating. Losing Natalie to prison would destroy what was left of their family. Maybe Natalie Cochran was just a desperate woman who made catastrophic financial decisions. Maybe Michael's death really was a medical tragedy. Maybe the insulin levels were a coincidence. But then, investigators started looking more closely at the timeline. February 5th, the day Natalie canceled Michael's Virginia trip, she'd made a phone call. She called a friend who had a diabetic son. She asked to borrow insulin, said she needed it for a friend's child who'd run out. The friend gave her a vial. The next morning, Michael collapsed. Police went back to the autopsy. Michael's body had been cremated, but they had tissue samples stored at the medical examiner's office. They tested those samples specifically for insulin. The results came back positive. Massive amounts of insulin in his system, more than enough to kill him. Natalie was a pharmacist. She knew exactly what insulin does to a non-diabetic person. She knew the symptoms. She knew the timeline. She knew how long it would take. And when her husband collapsed with those exact symptoms, she refused to call for help. For 5 hours, February 6th, 2019, mid-morning, Michael collapsed on the kitchen floor. Natalie called friends to the house, not 911, friends. When they arrived, they found Michael unconscious, unresponsive, barely breathing. They begged Natalie to call an ambulance. She said no. He just needs to sleep it off. They asked again. Michael wasn't moving. His breathing was shallow. Something was very wrong. Natalie insisted, "I'm a pharmacist. I know what I'm looking at. He doesn't need a hospital." For 5 hours, Michael lay on that kitchen floor. For 5 hours, Natalie refused to let anyone call 911. She knew what was happening to him. She'd caused it, and she waited. She waited because she knew if paramedics tested his blood sugar immediately, they'd find the insulin. They'd ask questions. They'd investigate. But if she waited, if she let his body metabolize the insulin first, it would be harder to detect, harder to prove. Finally, after 5 hours, when friends threatened to call 911 themselves, Natalie agreed to take Michael to the hospital. By then, the insulin had done its work. Michael never regained consciousness. He died 5 days later. But here's what destroyed any remaining doubt. After Michael died, Natalie continued the Ponzi scheme. For 4 more months, she kept taking investors' money, kept making promises, kept spending. If Michael's death had been a tragedy that devastated her, she would have stopped. But she didn't stop. Because Michael's death wasn't a tragedy for Natalie. It was a solution. He discovered the fraud. He was going to turn her in. He was going to destroy everything she'd built. So she borrowed insulin from a friend, injected her husband, waited 5 hours while he died. And then she went back to running her scheme. January 29th, 2025. Harrison County Circuit Court, West Virginia. Natalie Cochran stood trial for first-degree murder. The prosecution presented the evidence: the borrowed insulin, the collapsed husband, the 5-hour refusal to seek help, the continued Ponzi scheme after his death. The defense argued Natalie couldn't have known the insulin would kill him, that it was reckless, maybe, but not murder. The jury deliberated for several hours. They found Natalie Cochran guilty of first-degree murder. The next day, January 30th, 2025, the jury made a recommendation to the judge. In West Virginia, juries can recommend mercy or no mercy in murder cases. Mercy means possibility of parole after 15 years. No mercy means life without parole. The jury recommended no mercy. Natalie Cochran became the first woman in West Virginia since 1991 to receive that recommendation. She will spend the rest of her life in prison. Michael's family spoke at the sentencing.
If she wanted to call an ambulance or how she wanted to get him there, and she told me that she would let him sleep it off because he'd had a seizure.
February 6th, 2019. Michael Cochran collapsed on his kitchen floor. His wife said, "He just needs to sleep it off." But Natalie wasn't a worried wife watching her husband have a medical emergency. She was a pharmacist watching insulin poisoning work exactly as she knew it would. She'd borrowed the insulin the day before. She'd canceled Michael's trip to Virginia, the trip where he planned to expose her fraud. She'd injected him that morning. And when he collapsed, she waited. For 5 hours, friends begged her to call for help. For 5 hours, she said no. He just needs to sleep it off. She wasn't in denial. She wasn't panicking. She was waiting for him to die. And then she continued stealing money for 4 more months, until police finally caught her. The jury heard all of it, and they recommended no mercy. 3 words that convicted her: sleep it off. She told friends he just needed to sleep it off. She was a pharmacist. She knew he was dying because she had poisoned him. Subscribe to her case files. Cases that make you rethink everything.